Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining Real Story Group's webinar today on web content management, marketplace trends to watch in 2022. We did this for digital asset management last week, had a great crowd, and looks like we've got a similar type of engagement going on today. So thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us for today's session. As you can see, our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, is here with us, and he'll be taking it through the trends today. I just wanted to share a couple quick housekeeping items of note as we get started, and a little bit of background about Real Story Group, as I see a number of new folks on the line with us today. So we will have some time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions or any feedback you want to share, you can enter that into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, for those of you that are present for today, you will be receiving a copy of these slides within the next couple of days, and a recording will be available on our website. So keep an eye out for that. I do also see a number of subscribers on the line. As always, our webinars are in your subscriber library, so you'll be able to access this anytime, whether it's in the next couple of weeks or in the next couple of years. So you can, put our feet to the fire, so to speak, in terms of trends, any predictions that we make. So you can feel free to do that at any time. So again, welcome and thanks for joining us. So a little bit about Real Story Group. Tony founded this company 21 years ago now, along the lines of consumer reports, where we would never work for or advise the vendors that we cover in any way. Our focus is on you, the technology user and buyer, and helping you find the products that are going to be the right fits for what it is that you're trying to do. So we have developed a reputation of being some of the toughest critics in this space, and it's a reputation that we're actually quite proud of, and that means we're doing our job the right way. So for those of you that are new to Real Story Group, that's where we really differentiate ourselves from some of the other analyst firms that are out there that have a little bit more of a quid pro quo relationship with some of the vendors in this space. Today, we're going to take a look at the blue line on the MARTECH stack vendor map. These are all the areas that we cover within our research and where we provide advisory services. So you'll see a number of different lines that are on the map. Today, we're going to focus on the blue line, which has really been the heart of our research since Tony started this company back in 2001. So, Tony, I'll turn things over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. This is always a bit of a trip down memory lane. Founded Real Story Group originally at CMS Watch back in the day. Some of you may remember it as that. And we've been covering web content management for 21 years. I've been working on web content management platforms now for 25 years. So it's been really fascinating to watch the evolution of this space over time, and something that, quite honestly, is kind of near and dear to my heart as well. Although I also have to add that the scope of WCM is changing, and in some levels, I think one of the meta stories here for 2022 is a continuation of a trend where the scope is becoming narrower and potentially relatively less important in your stack. Note that I'm not saying unimportant, because it's very important technology, but the times they are changing. We think some things are going to accelerate in 2022, and so I'd like to share that with you today. Of course, to understand the future, it's important to understand the past, and so just a really quick tour of some of the reference models that Real Story Group has used going back to our CMS Watch days, and why this matters for this new year, 2022. So we'll go decade by decade. In the 2000s, when we were first getting started in 2001, this was a reference model that we used for web CMS, that you had source content going in, you applied some business rules and some library services to it, and then you had content going out. And originally, the vision was that this would be multi-channel to the extent that you could push syndication, push content out to crude wireless devices, certainly web pages, but also PDF files and others. And this was kind of a reference model where your web content management system was the center of your digital world. And for many of us in the 2000s, certainly it was. Changed a little bit in the 2010s, where there was much more of a focus on horizontal integration. So you still had your web content management system in this green box, but it might be feeding, being fed images and video. It might be pushing content out to marketing and social channels. You had a variety of channels and interaction environments above it. So there's the beginning of the crude notion of a stack, ideally working off some sort of, customer data as well. And so not everybody's stack was particularly well organized or mature this way, but a big part of what we were trying to do in the 2010s was to try to modernize and professionalize these environments. And that's when we saw significant investments in web content management infrastructure and services, and certainly platforms as well, substantial increases in the licensing and sophistication of these platforms. We were there throughout the decade to witness it all, and we helped organizations, work through this reference model to try to figure out how these different pieces were going to fit together. But the reality is that there were many problems with this model, not the least of which was highly siloed content, data, and interaction, such that at the top, across our major channels, our customers were having wildly different experiences on our website versus e-commerce versus email versus social versus, other online channels. And this is causing a lot of friction within the organization. And a lot of those problems still endure today. And so one of the arguments we're going to make is beefing up your web content management platform in and of itself, may not necessarily solve that problem. Unfortunately, some of the major analyst firms at the end of the 2010s were really doubling down on the decade by talking about these so-called DXPs, because what was happening was major web content management vendors were acquiring other solutions like e-commerce and DAM, social listening and portals and personalization services, all kinds of things. And this brought the myth that there was such a thing as a DXP, of course, or digital experience platform. Turns out this was never something that you could buy. The term, unfortunately, is kind of persisted over the years, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But where we were left at the end of the 2010s, and certainly coming into the pandemic, was this silo problem. We were having isolated, disjointed, and inconsistent customer experiences because within these different channels, including the web channel, you had content, data, rules, planning, and analytics, and they were all kind of vertically integrated within these different channels. And so your customers had really inconsistent experiences. And there's sort of this DXP strategy that many web content management vendors had of sort of putting all these different pieces into your web platform or acquiring all these different other vendors who did these just wasn't really dealing with this issue. It was really more of a structural issue. We think the model for this decade is for more integrated customer experience is going to abstract out or isolate what we describe as these foundational services that you see at the bottom. So web will remain an important engagement silo along with email, mobile, now of course IoT, chat, and other things, but that we're going to have to take a more enterprise approach to certainly omni-channel operations, unified customer data, journey orchestration, customer intelligence, and this red box here that we call omni-channel content. I'll come back to that in a minute because we think there's a significant difference between omni-channel content and what's on offer from web content management vendors today in 2022. So this leads to the latest version of our reference model where we talk about a composable stack. We think this is really the only way to be agile and flexible and to modernize your environment and to deliver on the omni-channel promise that we're all making during the pandemic to our prospects and customers. So you have these variety of different engagement channels, interaction, delivery environments. These engagement services are still important, but you can see web content management or WCM in the green box is really just one piece of the puzzle. It's not necessarily, nor should it be necessarily, the center of your stack. It's just an important component. And increasingly, we're seeing investments going towards these enterprise foundation services for, yes, content and information management on the left. We have omni-channel content services, digital asset management, for many of you, product information management. And then this part in the center where we're seeing a lot of investment around data, customer data activation, customer data operations, enterprise data intelligence, data being abstracted out from these engagement services so that it can be applied universally. CDPs are, for many of you, a big part of that. And then decisioning, which is really interesting, around testing and optimization, personalization, journey orchestration, desire to want to do that at a more fundamental level and not just within the web channel, not just within the email channel, but to do that in a more omni-channel approach so that, for example, when someone calls into the call center, you know what special offer has been made to them, or maybe you have a next best action there that's coherent with what you're doing when they're on a website. So it's this notion of enterprise decisioning as well. And so this is having profound impacts on customer stacks going forward. Most of us, and I'm going to presume most of you, are still at the early stages of going through this enterprise foundation transition. This is an architectural view of it, but it does put the customer at the center. We're just not there yet. But this change is certainly happening. It may be happening slowly, but it is tectonic, and it is affecting the WCM marketplace. So you have vendors like Sitecore that historically tried to put a lot of these services into a single WCM platform, the so-called XP platform. That has not worked. That was really in a sense, the granddaddy of DXPs. They've admitted themselves that no longer works, and so they've acquired a number of other SaaS-based, primarily SaaS-based platforms to do things like digital asset management, to do things like CDP, to do things like social media, to do things like outbound marketing, to do things like personalization. Exactly what happens to the WCM is very interesting. They're likely going to be coming out with, and I've certainly talked about, a much more slimmed down, more narrowly focused web content management platform for the new decade. Exactly what that looks like remains to be seen, but it's a very different model than what they were doing before. So that's just looking at one vendor, Sitecore, but there are similar themes and trends transpiring across the entire web content management landscape. Is that the vendors can't really avoid some of these tectonic shifts that are happening in enterprise stacks. In particular, for today, I wanted to talk about what we call omnichannel content platforms. This is a very nascent market. I wish it was more mature than it is, but we think we're going to see a lot of maturation in 2022. It is an offshoot from the digital asset management marketplace, and it's this notion of being able to reuse and track content and asset and product components at a core level that are independent of engagement environments. So it's the ultimate in headless environments, except that digital and media assets are first-class objects and not an appendage to a more textual sort of page that you would see in a web content management system or textual component. And also data is a first-class object, and that's very important too, because there are data components that present as content that are very important for many enterprises. And so we see this trend where organizations are going to be investing in omnichannel content, that's going to be pushing a lot of components, either at a highly componentized level or potentially compound components, into these different environments, including your web content management environment. And so under this model, the scale of your WCM or your web content management in green becomes much lighter. It's really more around sort of long-term experiential or value story content, potentially some static or semi-static page management. The scope of WCM becomes narrower because all of your reusable content is now being managed and operated at a lower tier. And I'm here to tell you that there is not a web content management vendor in the green box today that can do what needs to be done in the red box here. You have vendors who say they can do multi-channel, but they can't really do omni-channel component asset management at the level that's really required here. So that means in 2022 that the scope for WCM is going to get ever skinnier. I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a good thing, and it's an opportunity for many of you to modernize and simplify that tier, to ideally spend fewer resources on it so that you can reallocate those resources elsewhere as needed. So again, I'm not suggesting that WCM is unimportant. It's terribly important. It's just not the center of your MARTECH stack, and it may not be the center of your overall kind of content management that you're doing, depending on the type of organization you are. So this is just reiterating this point that, you may have an opportunity here to get simpler at the engagement tier and potentially replace some heavyweight platforms with something that's lighter, simpler, and more right fit for the role that WCM is going to be playing going forward. So that was the first point. I wanted to remind you that if you have any input at all or questions, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can add anything that you disagree with, anything you agree with. If you want to share an anecdote, if you want to ask a question, we can use that for any kind of input, and we will definitely have time, just checking the time here, to get to that before the end of the session today. Now let's talk about an evolving marketplace and what are some of the themes that we see for 2022. So there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice any marketplace. With mature marketplaces, we tend to apply a complexity spectrum. So this is not a value judgment. We're just saying that there are some solutions that are more toolkit and platform-like on the far left, and then there are others that are simpler on the far right. These are all platforms, however, in as much as for all of these, you really are going to need some sort of developer help. It's just a question of how developer intensive they're going to be. And with developer intensivity, you might think of that as a negative, but it also then raises all kind of interesting possibilities and value equations that you can realize there as well. So it's a complexity spectrum. You've got toolkits, upper range vendors, and then mid-range vendors, and then you have a number of legacy solutions. We recently added SDL Tridian to that box. They're grayed out because these tend to be solutions that you leave rather than you start afresh with. So what can we say about this market? Well, here in the year of our Lord 2022, traditional analyst firms still miss the breadth of this marketplace, just the sheer number of plausible players. Platform as a service still predominates over software as a service. And so but their terminology starts getting really interesting because there are many managed platform vendors, certainly Adobe comes to mind, others as well, where they're describing it as software as a service because they're handling all of the upgrades for you. And there are some multi-tenant pieces around the management of the environment itself, but you shouldn't assume that it's built from the ground up multi-tenant SaaS. These are primarily what you see in the cloud, with some exceptions, some limited exceptions, are single-tenant platforms with varying degrees of vendor management if you'd like them to manage your environment. In most places, in many cases today, you do. So it's still very much of a platform as a service play, even now going into 2022. Significant competition over perceived usability and editorial models. Some platforms are better at highly componentized, complex environments. Others provide much simpler sort of page management solutions. Again, not making a value judgment, but that's a key distinction here still in 2022. There's some competition on architecture, including cloud architectures. We believe the emergence of head optional is going to be the dominant model here, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing that's going on is a kind of a major market squeeze. This has been going on for the last decade, particularly pronounced in the last 2 years. We think it's going to continue to be pronounced, where the whole market is getting squeezed to the left, which means that the simpler solutions continue to go up market. The mid-range vendors are being pushed by page site builders like Squarespace and others. They're challenging the upper range. The upper range are challenging the toolkits. And so the good news is that as the market gets kind of compressed a little bit towards the top, you can get, 80 or 90% of what you would get in an Adobe or a Sitecore, you can get in the mid-range today. And so that's good for you, the customer. So you definitely want to look at a wide range of solutions and not just go to the ones that have, I would say, the most mind share. And this, by the way, has led into the expansion into adjacent spaces among major players, which is another way of saying that we're seeing major WCM vendors like Acquia, like Sitecore and Adobe and Episerver and others, acquire vendors in adjacent domains as a way of achieving growth. So who are the main, Paolo's asking, who are the main providers with the most breadth of functionality on the omni-channel content layer? So I'll point you back to our subway map, and we'll come back to that at the end if we have time, Paolo, where we list 9 or 10 potential vendors there. The game really started with SendShare and Style Labs, now part of Sitecore, and has kind of expanded out from there. Alexander's asking a question about a couple of interesting things on this complexity spectrum, that we have Acquia and Drupal here. That's true, we do. And we tend to make a distinction between the two. Acquia clearly has kind of captured the high end and has been the one driving towards Drupal 9 and ultimately Drupal 10, and the rapid transformation of Drupal into becoming a more kind of mainstream developer-oriented platform as opposed to the good old-fashioned hacker platform that it was. What's interesting, of course, is that even though now Drupal 8 is officially sunset, the majority of Drupal implementations are still running Drupal 7. So, you know, there's clearly a fork in the market. Acquia is going one way, the rest, significant portions of the Drupal community are going in another way. And so we tend to look at them differently. CrownPeak and eSpirit CrownPeak did acquire eSpirit. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Any general guidelines? David is asking about spending for license versus customization. So, you know, web content management systems, particularly as they get more complex, are known for being now sort of enterprise tier platforms. And in the enterprise, historically, you spent 2 to 6x on implementation as you do licensing. The cloud has shifted this a little bit because your licensing costs now include hosting and other services. It's become a lot more lucrative for the vendors, so maybe that ratio is a little bit lower. Also, we have a tendency to see these implementations never end. In other words, you may do an initial migration to a new platform, but you're constantly going to be working on it. So, you know, you want to keep your vendor close, but your developers even closer. If you ever look at the adoption rate of these platforms, Barbara's asking this. It's a great question. And adoption used to be a bigger issue than it is today because this notion that we would have all of our subject matter experts inputting content into these platforms has kind of gone away, and it's become a little bit more of a specialist play, Barbara. And so, and a lot of the platforms have become more complicated and have really geared themselves towards this notion of somebody who's like in the platform all day. This is what they do. Having said that, there are different usability issues, and there have been adoption issues, particularly with headless platforms where people had a different experience. So when there's a mismatch between what the vendor was, what you as an author and potentially an experience manager were expecting to get and what the platform actually delivered, then there are the adoption issues. And so we've definitely seen cases where one department or one group within the enterprise selects a tool and it's rejected by other departments or other groups because the model was not really suitable for that other group. And so I raised this because, of course, headless is still very much something that architects and developers are excited about, authors and editors not always so much. We think the future is sort of hybrid models where you can do both page and experience management as well as headless, depending on the use case. Another way of putting this is that headless is a feature and not necessarily a religious choice that you should make. Unfortunately, there are some vendors out there who believe that the only way to do this is headless, and they're wrong. And in cases where an enterprise has selected a headless platform as the only alternative, there are times when more coupled use cases make sense, and then they've literally had to go somewhere else, or in some cases, the team goes off and like licenses WordPress, which is not ideal. So we think that the future is not either or, but both, and I think that we're seeing a lot of convergence in the marketplace. Certainly, I think 2022 is going to really bear that out. So quick time check. All right, what does this mean for the market? So here are the key takeaways for 2022. The web content management marketplace is still highly fragmented, but it is compressing, and it's compressing towards the upper tier as there's more pressure from below. So there are some cautions there on the top and the bottom of the market. At the top of the market may be way overkill for what you need. At the bottom of the market, you may get away with something even simple like a Squarespace. So in particular, there's some concerns about the top of the market kind of overstretching and maybe overweighted with some technical debt. As I mentioned, remain cautious about headless only. Headless is a use case and not necessarily a universal architectural paradigm. There is a meta trend that we think is going to accelerate in 2022 around externalizing previously bundled services. So another way of putting this is these are things that maybe you used to use in your WCM, but as your digital stack gets larger, more complex, certainly more omni-channel, you will want to execute these services elsewhere, and your WCM becomes a consumer of these services. So things could be upstream content operations, A/B testing and optimization, certainly personalization, analytics, digital asset management, and other component assets, including an omni-channel content platform. So these are the sorts of things where your WCM is becoming more of a consumer of services rather than a producer of services, in a place where other things that are getting managed elsewhere are being executed through your web content management system, potentially. Some of the vendors, including the traditional kind of DXP vendors, are promoting this notion of composable DXP. So this idea that DXP was always a pipe dream, they never really existed, but as they acquire more firms and they say, well, we'll give you a composable DXP where you can buy different piece parts. So that's not bad. I understand the strategy. The one thing is that if it's composable, then why get all the pieces just from your web content management vendor? Nominally, they'll say that they work better together. That's rarely the case. We're big believers, in particular, that the larger enterprise, the more you're going to want to go best of breed for different boxes. And so we think not in terms of a composable DXP, but a composable stack. And once you start turning that picture around and looking at your stack as the subject in the grammar of this sentence, then it becomes a very different conversation. Now, someone mentioned Crown Peak getting acquired by Crown Peak acquiring eSpirit. So two vendors did get acquired. One vendor merged with, quasi-acquired another vendor. This is pretty rare in this space. This has never worked very well historically. I can tell you, the last 25 years, I've never seen this turn out well. This is usually financial machinations among investors, and it usually means that one vendor or another has kind of plateaued or failing in the marketplace and gets scooped up by another vendor. So we haven't seen a lot of this. I don't know whether we'll see more of this. It's possible. The technical term for these are roll-ups. So I'm rolling up different web content management vendors under a single umbrella. There's not necessarily a lot of value for you, the customer. So I'm not very optimistic about whether this is a good thing. In fact, it tends to not be a good thing, but we may see more of these. So as you're thinking about selecting technology, just wanted to reiterate that you want to take a more agile approach centered around design thinking. We've got a lot of webinars about this. I won't linger too much except to say that we wrote the book on this, and you should feel free to check in with us before you go and make a significant decision around web content management, your web content management choices. On the one hand, we've got all the inside skinny on the different vendors that you can get in our research. On the other hand, there's also this guide to a very practical, agile, hands-on methodology for making those choices. Okay, some other questions are piling up. We will get to that then in just a second here. Just wanted to reiterate there's 3 different ways that you can work with Real Story Group. The first one, which the vast majority of our subscribers do, is they just license our research. They get access to all the decision tools and composable quadrants that you can make using our Real Quadrant Generator, where you input your requirements and priorities, and then it gives you a custom short list, and with all the research behind it, the pros and cons of the different vendors to justify it. The second choice is what we call a full stack subscription, where you get access to all of our research and we help advise you on your broader stack decisions. And then the third, there's a subset of those who join our MARTECH Leadership Council. These are MARTECH leaders who meet every 2 months or so. Before the pandemic, we did it in person. Now we're doing it virtually. We'll do it in person again to help answer each other's questions and share ideas. We've got one early next month that I'm really excited about, where people are going to be sharing their MARTECH org charts. So that's very exciting going forward. So that's how we can work together going forward. And this is my colleague, Scott, who introduced me today. This is how you can get in touch with him and get in touch with us. Scott, we've got some questions backing up here. Why don't you just talk about next steps while I take a look at them here?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And what Tony mentioned is that I'm be happy to explore these different options with you in further detail, whether that's the research itself around web content management or the Stack Leadership Council. So if you ever want more details about that, reach out to us. at explore@realstorygroup.com. The next webinar will be on March 2nd, where we'll take a similar look at the CDP technology landscape. It's an ever-changing space, so we'll help you navigate that for the coming year. So Tony, I'll kick it back to you for the questions that
are quite a few questions that backed up here, so we'll run this a little bit long today. Manju's asking, sorry if this is a basic question, what are the unique aspects of omnichannel content over and above the digital content being managed for marketing, sales, and e-commerce channels? It's a great question. I mean, our short answer is that omnichannel content are those components that you want to reuse or repurpose across, maybe do derivations across multiple channels, typically more than two. And so you would need to manage them as an enterprise asset rather than having them get stuck in your e-commerce channel or stuck in your email channel. Ben is asking, we're struggling to find qualified integrators for Contentful Next.js. There's a lot of learning on the job. That's absolutely true. I mean, you know, there's a whole raft of developer-focused web content management systems out there that tend to get picked by developers, and they can be very powerful, but that means that you have to actually find the developers who know these systems, and they can be somewhat arcane. I think that's one of the dirty little secrets about WCM vendors over the years, is they have not always hewed very closely to industry standards in the way that you might have expected. So Mark is asking a question. Are there more new entrants in the market now than ever before, and are they changing it, or is it mostly consolidation, acquisition, merger? Is it driven by private equity firms and throwing out the innovation? Well, Mark, what I would say is there's probably the same number of firms as always. Some drift out, some drift in. We've been tracking typically 30 firms for the last 20 years that we've been doing this. So the number of prominent vendors stays about the same, but there's definitely new entrants. And then there are some like Trivian that fade away. And so the role of private equity here is really more, in, I think, maybe sustaining some companies that maybe a little bit longer. In some cases, we saw this two vendors being put together. Again, I'm not saying about that. There's less venture funding in this space because it's not considered terribly innovative or lucrative. But, you know, I think we'll probably see more private equity plays, and it's likely to be around consolidation in the future. Alexander's asking about commercial and open source systems in the WCM market, especially because of in Europe in general, public sector is being pushed more towards open source platforms than commercial. That really has been going on for the last 2 decades. We see that to a lesser extent in the public sector in North America as well, also higher ed. So it's been interesting watching the evolution of open source and web content management, and I would say that generally speaking, the commercial open source vendors have tended to predominate. And those, even though some that were more community oriented, like Magnolia and Hippo back in the day, have become much more commercialized, and now even don't even have open source components at all. So I think what the whole market borrowed from the open source movement was this notion that they needed to have better communities around their platform, have developed better customer and developer ecosystems, but that the community model itself was very difficult for generating innovation for what is essentially a business-facing tool. Drupal is a good example of that, where Acquia has more or less hijacked the roadmap going forward. They brag about all the different community source modules, but Acquia themselves increasingly doesn't even use them in their own distros. So I'm not suggesting the open source model is dead, but and there have been a lot of open source contributions and a lot of open source platforms underneath the hood of any web content management system. It's more that the community open source model, for whatever reason, has not proven as successful as the commercial open source or indeed the commercial model. And I think the advent of the cloud is going to make that even more extreme, that if you get to multi-tenant cloud, you know, software as a service, it really calls to question just the whole licensing model in general. So thanks, folks, for staying late. Really enjoyed this chat. Love talking about web content management. If you have some WCM choices in the future, feel free to check in with us. We have been watching this for 25 years. We have opinions, but they're backed by research. And the good news is you can get direct access to the research and draw out of the knowledge base custom deliverables that you need to help you and your colleagues make better decisions. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne and the rest of the team at Real Story Group signing off for now. Bye now.